Hi, I'm Ted Pattison from the Power BI Customer Advisory Team, or what we like to call PBIX. We're here today to talk about building multi-language reports in Power BI. Now, throughout 2022, there are a bunch of enhancements to Power BI that have made it, much easier and make us far more productive in creating reports that support multiple languages. So let's go ahead and get started. Power BI has great features for internationalization and localization to create reports that support multiple languages. We just have to figure out how to use them. But what's possible is that you can design a report that renders in several languages, maybe English as the default language, but can also load with Spanish, French, or German, depending on the user base for that particular Power BI report. So it's completely unnecessary to use the old school technique of taking the English report, doing save as, and then going through all the steps, to basically localize that. So building multi-language reports will certainly decrease maintenance and overhead. Now, what are those features I talked about? So there's a bunch of features that make, the story for building multi-language reports much better than it was a year ago. So now the user culture function is fully supported, and we can use that to write measures that inspect the user's language and basically dynamically implement translations. Now, we also have more properties in Power BI Desktop, for the visuals and shapes that we find on reports. And so for properties with text that shows to the user, we can now configure them with these measures. Finally, there's this new powerful feature called field parameters, and they offer, much better options when it comes to implementing data translations. Now, you'll also see that the guidance in this video series, is going to be based on an external tool named Translations Builder. So Translations Builder is made to work with Power BI Desktop, the two of those together. Now, Power BI Desktop requires Windows, so Translations Builder requires Windows as well. Now, there was a first version of Translation Builder that we first published in July 2001. But what we've done is we've put a lot more work into this utility just to boost the productivity of content creators using Power BI Desktop. Okay, before we jump into the technical content, let's get everyone excited about this multi-language report live demo that we have. So if you follow the URL that you see on your screen, you can look at a report and how it renders in English, and then how it renders in Spanish and French and German and Dutch and Italian and Portuguese and what's that? Oh, it's all Greek to me, but Russian, Japanese, Chinese, Hindu, and Hebrew, just to basically show you an example of what's possible. Okay, let's start with the very fundamentals. How does Power BI support metadata translations? It supports metadata translations for dataset objects, and more specifically for properties of dataset objects. Now, the supported types of objects that we can add translations to are tables, columns, measures, hierarchies, and levels within a hierarchy inside of a Power BI dataset, or what we think of as the data model. Now, there is the obvious property for the name. I want to change a column name. I want to change a measure name. And so it is the caption property that we use to set the names. So basically, all I'm going to look at as we go through this guidance is dealing with the caption property. You can basically also add in support for descriptions and display folders if you'd like. Now, what you'll see is that working with metadata translations today, as of January 2023, are only supported in workspaces associated with a premium capacity. It can be a P SKU, an A SKU, an EM SKU. It's just you can't run these reports in the shared capacity. And kind of the low level explanation is it just doesn't have the plumbing to support the loading, of the metadata translations. The last key point here is that metadata translations are supported at the dataset level and not at all at the report layout level. So some of the things that we're going to have to do, is innovate how we're going to support translations for things that are in the report layout, when Power BI doesn't offer a direct feature for that. But what we'll see is, we have a great solution for that. Now, a fundamental aspect of learning how to build multi-language reports has to do with you learning how the Power BI service loads reports with a specific language and locale. Now, the idea is that as Power BI is loading a report for a user, it has a user context that tells, which language to use and what regional locale that user is from. And by default, Power BI is going to be able to get these from the default browser settings of the user. However, in some scenarios, especially during testing, you can add the language parameter to the end of the report URL, and you can add a specific language and a specific locale. When you have a development effort with Power BI embedding, you have lots of control to load a report with any specific language or locale. Now, we talked about the user culture function. Now, let's look at a couple example return values that user culture might give us. So what you can see here is that you have return values such as en-us and es-es. And so the first two characters are the lowercase language identifier. The second characters, the uppercase ones, are the regional identifier. So the language is used to tell the Power BI service, and you, as someone who's building a report, what language the user speaks, but the locale is generally used for things like the formatting of numbers and dates. Okay, well, let's spice things up with a couple of DAX expressions. First, we'll call user culture, and we'll take the first two characters on the left to figure out what language they're using. And then what we're going to do is we're going to form this basic pattern for implementing report label translations dynamically. The idea is if I can figure out the language ID, I can then have a switch function. And what we could see here is that we're calling out if the language is Spanish or French or German, use these translations. And note that the default language in this case is English, but we don't call that out explicitly. Instead, we have that be the default. So if the user's context shows a language we don't support, we want to fall back on something, and it will be the default language for this particular project. Okay, I know what you're thinking. How hideous would your life be if you had to write and maintain measures like this in Power BI Desktop? Don't worry about it. We got a tool that's going to do all this work behind the scenes. Stay tuned. One little thing I want to call out is if you use our live demo, or if you go through the hands-on lab we have for this, what you'll see is that up in the banner, we basically display the return value of user culture for the current user. And that allows you to see things. So not something you would probably do in a real application, but because these are learning resources, we're going to just kind of have you be able to kind of always see, how the report was loaded in terms of what language and what locale. Indulge me while I demo the live demo. What you can see up top here is that we have ENUS. But now let's go and look at something, such as German. And what you'll see is all the translations are going to switch. I'm able to kind of go across these different pages right here. And one of the features that we kind of wanted to build in was when you go to another language, you're on the 5th page, keep that page, so you can look at one page, how it works, across different languages, and always going back up here, to the top and seeing, what is the language and locale that is kind of causing the report to load in this particular fashion. Now, one thing you've already learned is that occasionally you're going to have to write a measure that looks at the user's language and conditionally returns a value based on their language. Well, we have to do the same for the formatting of dates and numbers. And fortunately, the answer is no. In most cases, Power BI visuals just do the right thing. More specifically, the visual will take a value, it will look at the user's locale, it will look at the formatting string, for that particular value, and from those two things, it will do the formatting. So what we're going to see is that it will just work out. What you have to do is make sure you use formatting strings, that support regional formatting. So short date, long date, those are great ones to use. You can see some of the other formatting, might hard code the pattern of, what the short date should be. So, don't use those, experiment with them. Here's an example of short date formatting, across different locales. If you want to test this out, just go to the first page of the live demo. So here we say English, and if we look at all the numbers and dates down along the bottom set of card visuals, let's go ahead and switch that, over to Spanish. And we'll see that because I use short date as the format string, things just work out, without any problem. I'll switch over to Italian, I'll switch over to Greek. And once again, it's something that as long as you keep things generic and have good format strings that work reliably, the formatting of numbers and dates in most cases just works out without you having to do anything explicit, which is great. Now we need to take a step back and explain that there are 3 different types of translations that you have to understand when you build multi-language reports for Power BI. First, there are going to be metadata translations, and for any project, you're going to be required to, create these. And basically, they're the translation for the dataset object names, for tables, columns, and measures. Now, also, there are report label translations, which are always going to be required. So any type of literal text value that is displayed on the report that is not, a dataset object such as a table or column, is going to fall into this category. So what we need is to provide localized text for things like report titles, section headings, button captions. And then finally, we have data translations that are sometimes but not always required for you to implement. But the idea is that these are translations of text-based column values in the rows of the underlying data. For instance, product names, category names. If you have a report that displays in 4 different languages, do you want to translate product names, into all 4 languages? So what we'll see, is that data translations, are the hardest thing to implement. And, you have to decide, whether your project requires them or not. More on this later. Now that you know about the 3 different types of translations, let's look at examples of each one just to give you a little bit more context. So once again, metadata translations provide localized values for the names of columns and measures. So inside of the live demo, something like a table, if you look at the headings for the columns in a table, it's measure names and column names. Also, if you look at the card visuals on the first page of the live demo report, you'll see that the names of the measures are basically shown, just below their values. Now, metadata translations turn out to be the easiest ones to create, because once you basically add them into the place that they need to be, they basically just work. They load automatically. Now, let's look at an example of report label translations. Now, remember, report label translations are there to provide localized values for text elements on a report when that text is not directly associated with a dataset object. So examples of that would be the title of a report, any type of section heading, and obviously the navigation button captions that we have. Now, unlike metadata translations, Power BI doesn't provide a direct feature to support report label translations. So what do? We innovate. And the best practice is to implement report label translations, with a user culture function and some type of expression that dynamically performs the translation on the fly. And now on to the third and final type of translation, data translations. So data translations are used to localize text values from the underlying rows of data. So for instance, in your database table, you have a text column for product name. Do you want that product name, to be localized for different languages? So the live demo includes translated names for products, categories, and countries. So for instance, as you look at a table, it loads translated versions of the product names. If you look at certain Cartesian visuals, you'll see that the axis labels, are supported with data translations, as are the names of categories, inside of a legend. Another place where data translations are going to show up is if you use slicers with text-based value. Each selection in a slicer is from the underlying data. Now, one thing to note is that data translations are going to require more effort than implementing the other two. We're going to get into a lot of the details later in this video series. Here, I'll just call out that there is this new feature that I've mentioned already named field parameters, and the best practice is to base your data translations implementation on top of the new field parameter feature. One more slide on some fundamentals. Now, there are two popular styles for content creators who create data sets and reports with Power BI Desktop. Now, there is a style where you build both the data set and the report into a single PBIX project file. And it certainly makes things more convenient when it comes time to deploy, or if you're maintaining both, being able to have both, in a single PBIX file for deployment. Now, what many companies and organizations have found is that it's much better if they split their data set definitions and report layouts out into separate PBIX project files. That gives the team that's managing the data sets complete autonomy to keep upgrading their data set over time. And it gives report authors, the ability to update their report layouts, without having to, work with the data set team with a single PBIX project file. Now, what's good news is that the guidance that we're going to present here will work equally well depending on whether you're using style 1 or style 2. There are certain tasks that you perform on the data set. There are certain tasks you do in the report. And once again, the style will work just fine, using either of these styles with Power BI Desktop. On the Power BI CAT team, we appreciate that many of you have different learning styles. Some people like to learn about technology by watching YouTube videos. For example, you're watching a YouTube video right now. Other people like to read through in-depth technical articles. So we have a guidance document, which is titled Building Multi-Language Reports in Power BI. It's available through this URL, aka.ms/multi-language report guidance. And what you'll see is it's 46 pages and a lot of in-depth explanations of the concepts, but also a very practical, walkthrough of what are the tasks you have to perform to be successful at building multi-language reports. Now, we also know that some people really like getting their hands dirty to really appreciate technology. So we've created a fairly large set of lab exercises that take you through the end-to-end experience of building a multi-language report for Power BI. That's available through aka.ms multi-language report lab. Now, we have this sequence of lab exercises. In lab exercise 1, you will create and test metadata translations for the names of measures and columns. Lab 2, we're going to use the translations builder capabilities to call to the Azure translator service to generate machine translations, and that makes it very quick and easy to get your first round of translations, for both metadata translations and, as you will see, report label translations. Now, we also have a strategy that we're going to present for implementing report label translations using something called the localized labels table. And so the document explains how that works, and in the lab we'll take you step by step, through how to implement report label translations in a very quick and easy way. Now, in exercise 4, we're going to talk about taking your translations in a project and exporting them so you have a translation sheet that you can send out to another human acting in the role as a translator. Once that human sends back the updated translation sheet, you have to learn how to import those translations, back into your project. Now, exercises 5 and 6 is where we work through the details of implementing data translations. And I think you'll find that exercises, 1 through 4 go pretty quick. And, the meat of the lab where you spend time, working with the data model and adding things by hand in Power BI Desktop, is when you get to the part where you're implementing data translations. Okay, now we have a certain category of campers at Power BI Dev Camp, not you, mind you, it's other people, but they don't want to do the lab. And for those people, not for you, mind you, what we're going to do is, as we go through this video series, we're just going to kind of work through the lab. And so what I'll do is I'll just kind of start right now with the first part of the lab. And as we go through, the different sequence of videos in the series, you'll keep see, how you would work through the lab. Of course, we know you're going to do the lab exercises yourself. And that we very much respect. Okay, now let's take a quick walkthrough to get started with this lab. What you'll see is that this lab is available in an online version, and it's also available for download in doc or PDF format. Now, there are a couple prerequisites. So the lab assumes that you're already experienced with Power BI Desktop and you don't need to learn how to build queries in the Power Query window or how to model data sets or reports. It's assumed that you're proficient in that area. The second prerequisite is you have to install the utility called Translations Builder. And there is an installation guide page here to walk you through that. Finally, you have to have a Power BI environment with a workspace where you have appropriate permissions to publish PBIX files. And then also you can see this little diamond right here. So as I move over here, I can see that I have a workspace that has the diamond. If you don't have a diamond, you don't have the correct plumbing to load metadata translations, and none of this will work. So those are prerequisites you're going to need. Now, there's also a set of student files. So for instance, let's go ahead and click on this, and as I download this and I open the student files, what you can see is that there is a starter file. So this is going to be the PBIX file you start with in Lab 1, and you will continue to work with a single PBIX file, across all the labs. So you'll end up, kind of completing the end-to-end experience of localizing, the 3 types of translations. Also note, in student files, there is a solution. So for every exercise, we have the completed PBIX file. If you'd like to open it up and examine it with Power BI Desktop, or with Translations Builder. And then finally, there are a couple times, especially in the later labs, where we ask you to copy and paste a snippet of code. And so what we've done is we've put those snippets of code inside here. Just if you find it difficult to copy and paste out of the lab manual, this might be a little easier. Now, inside the lab, what we have you do is we have you take this starter file and then copy it somewhere, on your local hard drive. So we just have product sales.pbix inside here. And so now, if I open that project in Power BI Desktop, here's the project. Note we have 3 report pages. So this is really just kind of a slimmed down version of the live demo. Instead of supporting 12 secondary languages, we're going to support 3. Instead of having 6 pages, we have 3 pages, but it's going to show you the techniques that you need. As you start with the first lab, we want you to kind of look at the report, and there is the second page, sales by category, and then sales over time. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have you, get an appreciation for, what the data model looks like, what things are hidden and not hidden. And then also what we'll find is that anytime you want to add multi-language support to a Power BI report, you're going to have to go through this process of doing the work in Power BI Desktop and then clicking Publish. And the idea is we want to take this particular report. Now we're going to go find a particular location. And so there is Dev Camp Labs. And so we go ahead and we publish this report. And once we have published this report, okay, we'll wait one more second. Success. I could click on this link, or I should just be able to kind of go back, to that particular workspace and load in. And what you'll see is that there's the report that we're going to work on. And as I come up here, notice that everything's showing in English. Notice that up here, let's do a quick teaser with the language query string parameter. And so let's say that I want to see things in French. So we switch it to a language code of FR for French, hyphen uppercase FR for the locale of France. I go ahead and hit OK. And what we'll see is that the Power BI service is happy to translate everything into French, but my report doesn't know how to do that yet. As we move through the labs, here's our starting point, and we want to go from soup to nuts, to basically implement metadata translations, report label translations, and data translations. Okay, buckle in, get ready for the ride. Okay, onwards and upwards. What do we have in our next video? Part 2, creating and testing metadata translations.